New U.S. military budget focused on China despite border talk. Washington. New Chinese bombers. Chinese hypersonic. To a remarkable degree, the 2020 Pentagon budget proposal is shaped by national security threats that Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan has summarized in 3 words: China. The U.S. is still fighting small wars against Islamic extremists, and Russia remains a serious concern, but Shanahan seeks to shift the military's main focus to what he considers the more pressing security problem of a rapidly growing Chinese military. This theme, which Shanahan outlined Thursday in presenting the administration's proposed 2020 defense budget to the Senate Armed Services Committee, is competing for attention with narrower, more immediate problems like President Donald Trump's effort to use the military to build a border wall. The hearing, for example, spent more time on the wall and prospects for using military funds to build parts of it than on any aspect of foreign policy, including the conflict in Syria or military competition with China, Russia, or North Korea. Shanahan is hardly the first defense chief to worry about China. Several predecessors. China. The $25 billion the Pentagon is proposing to spend on nuclear weapons in 2020, for example, is meant in part to stay ahead of China's nuclear arsenal, which is much smaller than America's but growing. Shanahan said. Shanahan ticked off a list of other Chinese advancements: hypersonic missiles against which the U.S. has limited defenses. Space launches. Bonnie S. Glaser, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says the U.S. has been lacking effective strategies for competing with China on a broad scale. Some defense analysts think Shanahan and the Pentagon have inflated the China threat. In Preble's view, competition with the Chinese is not mainly military. In his previous role as Deputy Defense Secretary, Shanahan, and President Donald Trump's first Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, crafted a national defense strategy that put China at the top of the list of problems. That explains in part why the U.S. is spending billions more on space, including means of defending satellites against potential Chinese attack, and on building hypersonic missiles to stay ahead of Chinese and Russian hypersonic weapons development. It also explains some of the thinking behind preparing for an early retirement of the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier, a strategy that views carriers as a less relevant asset in a future armed conflict involving China. This concern about countering China has permeated the entire U.S. military. The top U.S. commander in Europe told Congress this week that China also is making inroads in Europe. China.
Raindrop, drop top, smoking, no cooking, the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park,